So in the early 1900s, Japan was getting into this whole imperialism thing. They beat up China and Russia and took Taiwan and Korea. They sided with the Allies during World War I and defeated Germany to expand their presence among the Pacific Islands. So far, they've been very successful. But Japan got more daring. They invaded China in 1931 and set up a puppet state in Manchuria called Manchukuo. Then in 1937, they began a full-scale invasion of the rest of China. As you can imagine, China is a tough enemy. It's a very large country with a large variety of terrain, but they were also in the middle of a civil war. Yet despite all that, while Japan occupied huge amounts of the coastal areas, as well as areas along the Yangtze River, there was a ton of resistance as the Civil War factions formed a united front against the Japanese. Meanwhile, Japan's aggression had finally made several other countries upset, some a lot more of a potential threat than others. As you can imagine, Japan's armed forces argued back and forth on what to do. There were three notable factions within the Japanese armed forces vying for favor. Faction 1, Toseiha, the control faction. Basically, they believed that China was enough of a problem. Let's not overextend ourselves and focus on what we're doing. Faction 2, Nanshin-ron, the Southern Expansion Doctrine. Supported by radical factions of the Navy, they saw the United States, and to a lesser extent the British, as the bigger threats. They had all of these colonies with resources that they needed to fuel their war machine, so they might as well surprise attack them and take them. If that sounds familiar, it should, because that's what they ended up actually doing in World War II. Then finally, Faction 3, Hokushin-ron, the Northern Expansion Doctrine. Supported by radical factions of the army, they saw the Soviet Union as the biggest enemy, and Siberia as the thing full of resources they needed to take. While it didn't have as many resources as the colonies in Southeast Asia, it would give them a large buffer zone from communist threats in Moscow. These factions, especially the two expansionist ones, were threatening conflict within the Japanese armed forces, and that was worrying. In the mid-1930s, the Hokushin-ron faction was actually winning, so to speak. Invading Manchuria was a part of their plan, so in effect they were on their way, but they needed to prepare for any conflict against the Soviets themselves. Not to mention they'd have to factor in that Mongolia is essentially a Soviet puppet state at this time, increasing the front line they need to deal with considerably. There were also other problems. Japanese tanks were not the best, to put it lightly. Many of their tanks in the early 1930s were inspired by older European designs and needed a lot of improvement. The Japanese didn't see tanks quite the same way the Germans and Soviets did, plus they didn't quite have the same manufacturing capabilities for making them either. But their armor was going to be essential for potentially invading the Soviets. On the flip side, the Soviets were worried about Japan somewhat as well. The Russo-Japanese War proved that Japan shouldn't be underestimated in a fight. While Japan wasn't an existential crisis to the Soviets, they were still someone to keep an eye on and not let their guard down. But as they were unsure on how they'd fare against each other, the two powers would conveniently get into a lot of accidental battles in the form of border conflicts. They'd have their forces violate the border and in some cases militarily skirmish with each other, but not actually declare war. Through these battles, the Japanese tested whether their plan to invade the North could be viable. Border incursions began as early as 1932, and by 1935 the number was in the hundreds, and magically no gunfire had been exchanged yet. But as the Soviets and Japanese trusted each other even less, the battles were going to happen eventually. But before we get to the battles, let's talk about this week's sponsor, World of Tanks. World of Tanks is a free-to-play PC game where you can use your favorite armored vehicles of war to clash with each other in combat, compete with over 110 million players, and join the right tank clan for you. If you download the game and register now with the link in the description, you can use the code TANKTASTIC to get a T127 tank, 500 gold, and 7 days of premium access. But remember, this is only for new players who register for the first time on the Wargaming portal. I mean, come on guys, tanks, what more do you need? Remember to sign up using the link in the description and the code TANKTASTIC. On January 8th of 1935, the Battle of Khalkhin Temple occurred when 90 Mongolian mounted soldiers ambushed some Manchurian and Japanese soldiers, numbering about 30. 11 Manchurian and Japanese soldiers died, while the Mongols lost around 30 or so. The Mongols technically won their ambush, but they also lost a lot of people too. But since one of the deaths was a high-ranking Japanese officer, this heightened tensions. In 1936, 128 Mongolian soldiers with some Soviet advisors invaded a disputed village called Taoran. Japan and Manchukuo responded with 400 soldiers and drove them out. Then in 1937, some Soviet forces tried to take a small river island along the border, lost 37 people, and withdrew. So that's 2 victories for Japan. In the summer of 1938, the next battle was at Lake Khasan. 7,000 Japanese and Manchukuo soldiers clashed against a little under 23,000 Soviet soldiers. While Japan held out for a while, they decided that they had reached an honorable conclusion and made an agreement with the Soviets on the official border for the area. But that wasn't the end of it. There was one more battle, Khalkhin Gol, the one battle from these conflicts that most people remember. The Kwantung Army, that is the Japanese army stationed in Manchukuo, was going to send the best it had for this 4-month-long battle. That's right, this battle technically lasted for 4 months. In May, it started with the usual skirmishes, but by June, the two sides had heavily increased troop presence. The Japanese had roughly 34,000 troops, 1,000 trucks, 400 airplanes, and 73 tanks. Meanwhile, the Soviets had 65,000 troops, 2,000 trucks, 900 airplanes, and up to 550 tanks. So, needless to say, the Soviet army outnumbered the Japanese significantly. Japan was able to inflict very high casualties, but the Soviets were simply able to consistently replace soldiers a lot easier than Japan could. By August, the Soviets decided to do a counteroffensive against the Japanese to end this, and what won the day was their tanks. Soviet BT-5 and BT-7 tanks ended up outmatching Japanese armor and was able to double envelop Japanese forces by going around them and attacking them from behind while they were distracted by the main army attacking them from the center. By the end of this battle, Japan and Manchukuo had lost around 19,000 men, more than half. The Soviets and Mongolians lost around 28,000, which, while more and still a significant chunk, was not enough to ruin the capabilities of their armies in the area. On September 15th, the two nations signed a ceasefire. Japan learned a few things. 1. Invading the Soviet Union was going to be way harder than they thought. 2. They were not good with tank warfare. And 3. Suddenly, the faction suggesting an attack on Southeast Asia seemed a lot more appealing to the higher-ups. Japan decided this, along with further embargoes by the United States later on, was why Pearl Harbor was going to be their ultimate gamble of choice. So Japan made that choice. It's interesting to note what might have happened had they gone the other way, though. The forces used in Khalkhin Gol were moved to Moscow as reinforcements in December of 1941, the height of the German invasion, when they were so close to taking it. Maybe if Japan attacked the Soviets by surprise instead, that couldn't have happened, and Moscow might have fallen. It's hard to say, but it's definitely interesting. I'm Emperor Tigerstar, and I'll see you guys next time. And once again, thanks to World of Tanks for sponsoring this video. Remember to use Tanktastic in the description.